I'll be talking about nutrient pollution in the Chesapeake Bay. A bit of background on this topic. Nutrient pollution is essentially any excess nitrogen or phosphorus that has made its way into the Chesapeake Bay. And excess meaning that too much of a good thing is not essentially a good thing, because too much of this nitrogen and phosphorus will cause excessive algae growth. And when too much algae is growing in the same spot, it eats up any of the dissolved oxygen in the water, which depletes any of the nutrients that were there before in excess quantities. So it occurs naturally, but that does not mean this is like something that is gonna fix itself or anything that is safe. So in the Chesapeake Bay specifically, there are three main causes that I can talk about today. One of them is these large agricultural areas. So runoff from these areas may contain the waste of any mass-produced chickens, cows, or any kind of animals that will be held on these large farms. And with how big the Chesapeake Bay watershed is, containing Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and the surrounding states, it all adds up and comes together in the Chesapeake Bay in this very large quantity, which it increases the amounts of algae way more than the ecosystem is able to handle on its own. Another is cars, like this one. Cars pollute the air with nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide, which from the air precipitates into the Chesapeake Bay and its surrounding areas in the watershed, which adds these airborne nutrients into the water as well, essentially polluting both. Another is any kind of erosion, whether it be from mountains. Like here in Virginia, we have the Appalachian Mountains, which their runoff does lead to the Chesapeake Bay eventually. Any sediment here could possibly be contaminated, whether it's by humans just not cleaning up after any of their hiking or camping equipment, or whether it's from acid rain or something. Like maybe there are some surrounding cities that are polluting the air, and since that air is contaminated, because warm air rises over cool air, it rises up into the mountains, precipitates, and then leads directly into the Chesapeake Bay due to runoff. So why does any of this matter? Well, as residents of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, we need to keep our source of water and recreation a huge revenue source, as well as for survival, because, well, it's a food source for humans as well as the organisms within its own ecosystem. We need to keep it in optimal condition because fresh water is already in a low supply, and the Chesapeake Bay it's an estuary, so it's a mix of both fresh and salt water, both of which are pretty important. We also may not completely eliminate this issue. There are natural causes to nutrient pollution, such as just simply erosion, but we can do we can do things to prevent this from getting worse. Like the EPA has various restrictions on the amounts of emissions that are allowed to come from cars. We have our inspections every now and then to make sure that the catalytic converters, which of course they limit the amounts of pollution like nitrous oxide in from the car's emissions, most specifically nitrous oxide, that doesn't help CO2 so much. So we have factories and such which have CO2 emissions. They are being regulated to not release over a certain amount of emissions. I believe it may be around 5% of CO2 emissions, maybe the EPA's limit on that. So some effects we have of nutrient pollution is of course excessive algae growth, but then we have these nutrient-free zones known as dead zones. They essentially look like the water under all this algae here. So you can see this water is all green, not not clear. You wouldn't want to drink or swim in that. This makes it difficult for humans to get clean water for consumption or cleaning or anything. And the water under the algae is very low in dissolved oxygen. So we can barely use this for really anything because it will accept contaminants just so easily. It also, obviously anything living in these conditions are at risk of death because with the low nutrients based on the algae taking it all, there's like no way for anything else to survive. Notice how it's called dead zones. It also causes property values to drop, low recreation, low food supply. It also is not very sightly. Many people do not enjoy looking at these things. So we have clean water, green water. You know, we have a lot of fish dying. There are some areas even being closed off from really bad water quality that just, yeah, not safe for humans or really anything to survive there. So I have this chart here. It'll essentially show like what happens with nutrient pollution. You can see here, like, in contrast to healthy, like, levels of nutrients, we have grasses under the water able to use sunlight to make food. There are organisms that are able to use this for shelter and, of course, food. And then with nutrient pollution, there's just nothing that can live here. We have no grass for habitat, so oxygen levels are decreased, so all of these organisms have nothing to breathe. And the algae itself will eventually cannibalize itself because with no nutrients, it can't grow either. So how can we fix this? Well, the most important reason is to limit how much pollution we are emitting into the air and water directly. We don't want to make this any worse than it already is. Otherwise, this could become it could lead to our water supply being permanently damaged forever and humans eventually dying off from dehydration. So we also need to limit contaminants in sediment. So like agriculture, we need to keep our animals from just going wherever they want. We need to make sure we clean that and dispose of everything properly. And we also need to make sure we're not leaving anything behind in any of our hikes and camping trips that might damage the sediment in those surrounding areas. The main takeaway message here is we need to make sure we clean up after ourselves instead of just letting everything spiral out of our control to the point where nature cannot keep up with